Picture this. You are standing in the marble corridors of a Macedonian palace, the air thick with incense, the murmurs of nobles echoing beneath a ceiling carved with gods who watch but do not interfere. The scent of myrrh mixes with the metallic tang of bronze lamps, and through the vast colonnade you see her a queen in white linen, her golden diadem trembling against a brow that refuses to bow. Her name is Arsinoe II, daughter of one of Alexander's greatest generals, but tonight that name means little. She stands motionless before the altar, her face an unreadable mask of serenity while her heart boils beneath it. The crowd below roars in celebration, but she knows this is not triumph. This is surrender, gilded, public, and irreversible. The man beside her, her half-brother, Ptolemy I, called the Thunderbolt, leans close, his breath reeking of spiced wine and victory. His arm slides around her waist, a gesture that looks affectionate but grips too tightly, as though he already senses she might one day flee him. To the priests and nobles, they are the image of divine union. To her, the crown he has just placed upon her head feels like a shackle forged by fate. The priests chant in Greek, invoking Zeus and Hera, those eternal siblings whose sacred marriage once embodied divine order. How ironic that she, a woman forced to marry her brother for the sake of politics, must now be blessed in the names of gods who shared the same blood. The ritual is ancient, but the cruelty is fresh. Around them, the nobles toast with honeyed wine, pretending not to see the revulsion that flickers behind the queen's calm eyes. She lifts her cup. The wine tastes of ash. Arsinoe has learned to smile at moments like this, moments when defiance could mean death. Once, when she was 15, her father had handed her to Lysimachus, king of Thrace, a man old enough to be her grandfather, his hair as white as the snows of Mount Haemus. The marriage had been political, a transaction written in gold and sealed with her youth. She remembered the wedding then too, the poets praising her beauty, the courtiers admiring her jewels, none seeing that beneath her veil she was trembling not with joy, but dread. Now, decades later, the pattern repeats. Another wedding, another promise of protection, another man who mistakes her silence for submission. Arsinoe had promised her safety, promised that her sons, born of her first husband, would be treated as heirs. But she has seen too much to believe in royal promises. Behind his smile she sees ambition sharp, cold, and predatory, the same hunger that once drove him to murder and steal the throne he now occupies. Through the crowd, she catches sight of her eldest son, Ptolemy, standing apart, half-shadowed behind a column. His face is drawn, his eyes fixed on her with a pain he cannot conceal. He had begged her not to come, not to trust this man. But a mother's love is a dangerous thing. It drives her to believe that even the wolves might be bargained with, if it means her cubs will live. The chanting grows louder, echoing off the marble walls like a dirge. "May the gods bless this sacred union," the priest intones. And she wonders, not for the first time, whether the gods themselves have grown weary of such ironies. Brothers marrying sisters, fathers selling daughters, queens swallowing their rage like bitter wine. When the ceremony ends, the music swells lyres and flutes, the sound of celebration masking the silence that presses against her chest. Courtiers shower them with petals, golden torches flicker across faces gleaming with false joy. Arsinoe's expression never falters. She knows how to play her part, but beneath the practiced grace of her movements, something ancient and fierce awakens. It is not hope, it is not even hatred. It is something colder, sharper, the instinct to survive. She has spent 25 years learning the language of power, when to speak, when to yield, when to hide her thoughts behind a smile. The palace is a labyrinth of daggers, and she has walked its corridors long enough to know that mercy is a myth. As Arsinoe raises his cup to toast their divine union, she returns the gesture, her gaze steady, almost serene. Only those who know her well, and there are few left alive who do, might notice the subtle tightening of her fingers around the cup, the faint tremor that betrays the storm behind her calm. Somewhere, deep inside, a vow forms silent, unspoken, and absolute. If she cannot escape this marriage, she will master it. If she cannot save her children through love, she will save them through cunning. And if the gods have written her fate in blood, then she will write the ending herself. The feast continues into the night. Musicians play until their fingers bleed. The nobles dance, oblivious, while the Queen of Macedonia, the woman they call sister wife, sits beside her new husband, and dreams not of escape, but of vengeance. In her eyes, the light of the torches flickers like distant fire, The same fire that once devoured the world in Alexander's conquests, now reborn in a woman who has lost everything except her will. As the night deepens, Keronos whispers promises in her ear, his hand heavy upon her arm. She nods, smiles faintly and says nothing. For silence, she has learned, is the sharpest weapon of all. Before she ever wore a crown, before the marble corridors of Macedonia, there was Alexandria, the city of light. It rose from the sea like a dream of eternity, a city where Greek ambition met Egyptian divinity, where philosophers argued beneath columns carved with lotus flowers, and ships from every corner of the known world crowded the glittering harbour. This was Arsinoe's birthplace, a place that taught her, from childhood, that beauty and wisdom were not gifts but currency. Her father, Ptolemy I, had once carried the corpse of Alexander the Great across the deserts of Babylon not out of devotion, but as a statement of inheritance. From that act of possession was born the Ptolemaic dynasty, an empire carved from the ruins of conquest. Ptolemy built Alexandria to rival Babylon and Athens both, and he filled it with scholars, priests, and spies. Power was its foundation, enlightenment its mask. Arsinoe grew up inside that duality. She spoke Greek in the palace and Egyptian in the temple courtyards, learning that each language opened doors to a different world. Her tutors taught her Homer by day and the hymns of Isis by night. To her Greek attendants, she was a princess. To her Egyptian nurses, a child of the gods. And yet, beneath all the education, she sensed the truth. She was being trained not for freedom, but for utility. Her stepmother Berenice once whispered to her, "A royal daughter is not born to love. She is born to bind kingdoms." It was advice given in tenderness, but it tasted like prophecy. When Arsinoe was 15, that prophecy came true. The year was 300 BCE. Across the former empire of Alexander, his generals, now kings, fought over what was left of the world. Alliances were as fragile as glass, and her father, ever the strategist, sought security through bloodlines. His solution? A marriage. Her groom was Lysimachus, king of Thrace, a man nearly 60, his body scarred from decades of war. He had once fought beside Alexander himself, killing lions with his bare hands and conquering cities in the king's name. When he came to claim his bride, he rode through Sardis, in a procession of gold and iron, an aging warrior surrounded by his generals, his white hair gleaming beneath the Anatolian sun. To the people, it was a union of empires. To Arsinoe, it was exile disguised as destiny. The wedding was a spectacle. The walls of the great hall shimmered with gold leaf. Courtiers toasted until their voices broke. Poets compared her to Helen of Troy, another woman whose beauty was traded for war. Dressed in robes of Tyrian purple, her dark hair bound beneath a crown of emeralds, Arsinoe stood beside a man old enough to be her grandfather. When Lysimachus placed the ring upon her finger, she felt the weight of empire in its circle. The ceremony was conducted in Greek, the language of conquerors, and every word sounded like a chain. But the girl learned quickly. In the months that followed, she studied the court of Thrace, as one might study a battlefield. Lysimachus's kingdom was vast but volatile, bordered by restless tribes to the north and rival kings to the south. His court, a nest of old soldiers and ambitious nobles, was thick with intrigue. Arsinoe understood that survival here would not depend on affection but on calculation. Within a year she gave birth to her first son, Ptolemy, followed soon by Lysimachus Jr. and Philip. Each child was a promise and a weapon. Every birth strengthened her claim, deepened her roots in a foreign court that would never truly see her as one of its own. But the shadow of another heir loomed. Agathocles, Lysimachus's son from an earlier marriage, older, established, beloved by the army. His existence was a threat to her son's future, and in the silent war of succession, there could be no neutrality. The court grew poisonous. Whispers slid through corridors like snakes. Some said the young queen's smile hid ambition sharper than any blade. Others claimed she had bewitched the king with Egyptian charms. Lysimachus himself, weary of age and haunted by betrayal, began to see treachery everywhere, and Arsinoe, with the cold logic of survival, knew how to turn suspicion into advantage. Historians would later argue whether she truly conspired against Agathocles. The truth is lost, drowned beneath centuries of rumor and fear. But what is certain is that Agathocles was accused of treason, condemned, and executed by his father's order. The old king's face hardened when he signed the decree, but his young queen did not flinch. When the executioners returned, their hands still red, she did not weep. For in the cruel arithmetic of kings, The death of a stepson meant the life of her own. Her victory, however, was poisoned. The kingdom split in outrage. The nobles who had loved Agathocles now hated her. Her husband aged rapidly, the weight of guilt pressing into his bones. Enemies circled the Seleucids in the east, the barbarians in the north. And in the midst of it all, Arsinoe, the foreign queen with 3 young sons, stood alone, surrounded by wolves. She learned to play them against each other. To some, she offered gold. To others, smiles. To a few, silence, her most dangerous weapon. She became a master of patience, letting rumors swirl until they devoured the men who spread them. And yet, beneath the calculation, there was something deeply human, the quiet terror of a mother who understood that her children's lives hung on every whisper in the throne room. When night fell, she would sit beside the cradle of her youngest, tracing his cheek with fingers that had already signed death warrants. "Forgive me," she would murmur to the sleeping child. "Forgive what power demands." Years passed. The world grew darker. The gods, those eternal witnesses to human folly, watched as one queen's cunning unraveled a kingdom built by warriors. In 281 BCE, the storm finally broke. Lysimachus, old and exhausted, marched into his final battle and never returned. His kingdom collapsed in a single season. And Arsinoe, once the most envied woman in the Hellenistic world, became a widow with 3 sons and no throne. But queens like her do not die quietly. In the ashes of a fallen empire, she began to plan her next move, one that would lead her straight into the jaws of the monster who bore her own blood. The kingdom of Thrace was dead. The old banners had burned to ash. The soldiers who once swore loyalty to Lysimachus scattered to the winds. The widow of the king, once adorned in gold and praised as a goddess, now fled through darkness with her 3 sons. Imagine it, a royal caravan moving through the Anatolian night. Horses stumbling over stones, torches hissing in the cold wind, the queen's cloak torn by thorns. The woman who had dined beside philosophers now drank rainwater from her palm. Every sound in the forest could have been a pursuer. Every flicker of light might have been an assassin's blade. Her sons rode beside her, Ptolemy, 17, and grim-faced, Lysimachus, 15, his courage not yet hardened, and Philip, a child of 12 who still cried for the nurse who'd been left behind. Arsinoe said nothing. Her silence was armor. She had learned that panic is contagious, but so is resolve. Behind them, Thrace burned. Before them lay only exile. News reached her that the conqueror Seleucus I, last of Alexander's surviving generals, had claimed victory and was marching toward the coast. The world was reshaping itself once again, old men dividing the remnants of Alexander's empire as if carving a corpse. Arsinoe knew that widows and orphans were among the first casualties in such games. She sought refuge in the port of Ephesus, her jewels traded for a ship. But before she could sail, the gods, with their cruel sense of irony, sent another player into the storm. Her half-brother Ptolemy I, exiled years ago from Egypt, had seized his chance. When Seleucus, the very man who had defeated her husband, prepared to cross into Europe, Kerounos struck like lightning. He murdered Seleucus in cold blood and claimed the Macedonian throne for himself. The old general's blood had not yet dried when Ptolemy styled himself king. His new title, Kerounos, the Thunderbolt. Then, word reached Arsinoe. Her brother had sent an envoy. The messenger arrived bearing gifts and promises, bowing low before the woman he called Queen of Macedonia. In honeyed tones, he conveyed Kerounos' offer: marriage, reconciliation, a dynasty reborn. He spoke of bloodlines united, of the god's will, of a future where her sons might inherit, not ruin but a kingdom restored. For a long time, Arsinoe said nothing. Her face was marble, her eyes unreadable. She remembered Kerounos as a boy ambitious, proud, a snake wrapped in silk. He had been her father's son in ambition, but his mother's in cruelty. Still, the choice before her was unbearable. If she refused, she would wander as a fugitive, her sons hunted across the seas. If she accepted, she would be queen once more, but chained to the very man whose hands were stained with a murdered king's blood. She accepted, not out of love, nor even hope, but from a mother's final desperation. Her eldest son, Ptolemy, she sent away under the pretense of diplomacy. "One of us must live," she whispered as they embraced. "If I fall, you must remember who you are." Her heart cracked as she watched the ship carry him towards safety, but she did not look away. Queens do not look away from sacrifice. When Arsinoe entered Macedonia, the city of Pella greeted her with fanfare. Trumpets blared, soldiers cheered, and Kerounos himself stood waiting, a lion draped in royal purple. He welcomed her with open arms and words that melted like wax in the sun. "My sister," he said, "let the past be buried. Together we will rule the world our father began." That night, their wedding was held in the same halls where Alexander the Great had once walked. Torches flamed against marble walls. Priests chanted to Zeus and Hera, divine siblings whose union the Greeks called holy. The irony was suffocating. The nobles looked on, whispering that perhaps this was the destiny of Egypt's blood, to imitate gods, even when it meant violating mortal law. When the ceremony ended, Kerounos kissed her hand, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. To the crowd, it was an image of divine harmony. To Arsinoe, it was the tightening of a noose. That night, while the city celebrated, betrayal arrived quietly. Soldiers stormed the chambers where her two younger sons slept. The boys, Lysimachus and Philip, barely had time to rise before steel flashed in the candlelight. Arsinoe's screams tore through the palace, echoing down corridors once filled with laughter. By the time she reached their room, the marble floor was slick with blood. Her sons lay motionless, the prince's diadems crushed beneath soldiers' boots. Kerounos stood at the doorway, his expression cold and almost tender. "It is mercy," he said softly. "Now there are no more rivals." For a heartbeat, the world was silent. Then something inside her, something human, shattered. They said later that her wail could be heard across the palace courtyards, that even the guards looked away in shame. But grief, for Arsinoe, was a luxury she could not afford. When the bodies were taken away, she did not collapse. She did not weep. She stood in the chamber until the blood at her feet began to dry, and then she whispered a prayer not to the gods of mercy, but to those of vengeance. That same night, while Kerounos drank himself into triumph, she escaped. Disguised in a servant's cloak, her hair hidden beneath a coarse scarf, she slipped through the palace kitchens and into the streets. With her moved a handful of loyal attendants, slaves, freedmen, and guards who risked their lives for the woman they still called queen. Behind her, she left a decoy, a slave woman who resembled her in build and voice, dressed in royal garments to delay pursuit. They crossed Macedonia under cover of darkness, bribes and forged letters buying passage through hostile lands. Every mile was peril, every sunrise, a reminder that her survival defied fate. The Thunderbolt's men scoured the countryside, but Arsinoe was a ghost, a mother turned phantom, guided only by fury. Her destination was Samothrace, an island sacred to the great gods, where even kings feared to shed blood. There, she found temporary refuge among the priests of the Mysteries men who accepted all fugitives who sought the gods' protection. By the time her ship reached its shore, the queen who stepped ashore was no longer the woman who had married Kerounos. She was thinner, harder. Her eyes, once bright with intellect, now carried the stillness of obsidian. She had lost her husband, her throne, and 2 sons. But she had kept the one thing no man could take, the will to endure. And in that endurance, somewhere between the salt of the sea and the silence of the temples, a new purpose began to take shape. If fate had made her the victim of kings, then she would become something higher, something the gods themselves could not control. What rose from the ashes of her grief was not merely a woman, nor a queen. It was the beginning of a goddess. For months, the island of Samothrace became her sanctuary, a place where grief was swallowed by the sea. The island was ancient, sacred, said to be protected by gods older than Olympus itself. Here, fugitives sought purification, sailors prayed for safe passage, and those who had lost everything came to be reborn. Arsinoe fit all 3. She lived among the whispering pines and salt winds, her nights haunted by dreams of blood and her son's laughter echoing in the waves. Each morning, she rose before dawn and walked to the cliffs, watching the horizon where Asia met the sky. Somewhere beyond that line lay Egypt, the land of her birth, the land she had not seen in nearly 20 years. At 40, her beauty had become something solemn, sculpted by loss. She had the stillness of a woman who had survived too much to fear anything left alive. The priests of Samothrace treated her with awe. She never revealed her name, but they sensed the truth. She carried the weight of a fallen dynasty, and her silence was a kind of prayer. But exile is a kind of death, and Arsinoe was not ready to die. When word reached her that the man now ruling Egypt was her younger brother Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, she understood what she must do. If there was any chance to rebuild her life, it lay with him. Egypt had changed since she last saw it. The empire her father carved from the corpse of Alexander had matured under new hands. The Library of Alexandria had become the greatest treasury of knowledge in the world. Scholars and mathematicians filled its marble halls, while the city's harbour gleamed with trade from India, Nubia, and Greece. To the world, Egypt looked like paradise. To Arsinoe, it was home and perhaps redemption. The journey from Samothrace to Egypt was perilous. Chersonis's assassins still hunted her, pirates prowled the Aegean, and the seas churned with autumn storms. But the queen who sailed south, disguised as a merchant's widow, was not the fragile bride she once had been. She had learned to travel light, to trust few, to hide her radiance behind the rags of anonymity. When at last her ship reached the harbour of Alexandria, the sight struck her like a memory and a wound at once. The city shimmered marble palaces rising beside golden temples, the Pharos lighthouse burning against the night like a star the gods had dropped too close to earth. But beauty does not erase suspicion. Her brother, Ptolemy II, was cautious, a scholar king, not a warrior. He had inherited Egypt in prosperity, and he ruled with the precision of a mathematician balancing equations of power. He welcomed her back with royal ceremony, but behind his measured politeness she could sense calculation. He was 26, 15 years her junior, but already moulded by the same palace intrigues that had once shaped her. The sister who returned to him was a legend, wrapped in scandal, the widow of one king, the sister-wife of another. A woman rumoured to carry both divine favour and divine curse. Their first meeting was not in a throne room, but in a garden. Arsinoe entered quietly, dressed not as a queen but as a penitent, her cloak still smelling faintly of the sea. Ptolemy stood beneath a fig tree, scrolls in hand, the cautious eyes of a ruler who trusted numbers more than people. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze stirred between them, carrying the scent of papyrus and lotus. When at last she bowed, it was not the bow of a supplicant, but of one equal acknowledging another. "So, sister," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you have come home." "I have come," she answered, "because there is nowhere left that is home but here." That night, the court whispered. Some said she came seeking forgiveness, others that she came seeking power. The truth was both simpler and more dangerous. She came seeking purpose. Egypt was prosperous, yes, but also restless. The Greeks who ruled it were always outsiders in the eyes of the Egyptian priests, tolerated but never fully accepted. The Ptolemies played at being pharaohs, but the ancient gods of the Nile demanded more than costumes and ceremonies. They demanded belief. And that, Arsinoe realized, was where her opportunity lay. She was Greek by birth, but she spoke the language of Egypt as fluently as the prayers of its priests. She understood its symbols, its myths, its sacred power. She had lived among kings who wielded armies and lost them all. Now she saw that Egypt required not another general, but a symbol, something divine enough to bind its people under one crown. Her brother, for all his intellect, was not that symbol. But together, brother and sister, king and queen, they could become one. The notion was audacious, perhaps even blasphemous, yet it was not without precedent. The priests of Egypt told stories of Isis and Osiris, divine siblings whose marriage had restored the cosmic order. To the Egyptians, such unions were sacred, a ritual of eternity. To the Greeks, it was abomination. When Arsinoe first proposed it, whether in word or in the long, deliberate silences she had learned to use, her brother hesitated. The weight of Greek morality pressed heavily upon him, but politics, like faith, often demands heresies. In the end, logic yielded to necessity. Their union, they declared, would not be mortal but divine. They were not mere rulers, they were the earthly reflections of gods. The court was stunned. Across the Mediterranean, philosophers denounced the act as madness, poets as decadence. But in Egypt, the people rejoiced. The marriage of brother and sister, of Ptolemy Philadelphus and Arsinoe Philadelphus, was proclaimed as a restoration of cosmic harmony, the rebirth of divine kingship. And in that moment, history turned upon itself. The woman once forced into incest for survival, now chose it for power, transforming the very act that had shamed her into a ritual of legitimacy. When the wedding was held in Memphis, beneath the towering pillars of Ptah's temple, the hymns that filled the air were older than the pyramids. Priests chanted verses that had been sung when gods first walked the earth. The bride and groom wore crowns, not of mortal kings, but of eternity itself. And as Arsinoe lifted her eyes to the golden reliefs of Isis and Osiris embracing in the heavens, she felt something shift within her. No longer victim, no longer exile. She was ascending, not just a queen now, but a goddess reborn. The air inside the temple of Ptah shimmered with incense and divinity. Columns carved 3,000 years earlier loomed like pillars of the cosmos, and beneath them, two figures stood hand in hand, crowned in gold and eternity. The priests sang in hieroglyphs, voices rising and falling like the slow pulse of the Nile. They spoke not to mortals but to the gods themselves, proclaiming that the union of Ptolemy Philadelphus and Arsinoe Philadelphus was no human marriage, but the recreation of the divine order. As Isis and Osiris had restored balance to the heavens, so too would this royal pair restore balance to Egypt. To the Greek courtiers watching, it was scandal. To the Egyptian priests, it was salvation. To Arsinoe, it was redemption and rebirth. She stood in robes of white linen edged with gold thread, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt resting upon her brow. Her brother wore the crook and flail, symbols of the shepherd and judge of men. Together they stood at the center of a tableau that fused two civilizations, Greek rationality and Egyptian mysticism, into one seamless image of divine power. When the final hymns ended, and the high priest raised his hands to bless them, Arsinoe did not bow. She looked straight ahead into eternity, her gaze steady as the carved eyes of the statues around her. For the first time in her life, she felt untouchable. Outside the temple, the crowds of Alexandria cheered. The people saw in her something they had never seen before, a queen who was not merely royal but sacred. In her eyes they recognized Isis, in her survival, the proof of destiny. The transformation was complete. No longer the widow of fallen kings, Arsinoe was now the living goddess of Egypt. In the months that followed, she redefined what it meant to be queen. Where other rulers sought to dominate through conquest, she ruled through symbols and story. She understood that in an empire of many tongues and faiths, belief was stronger than fear. Under her influence, Egypt became not just a kingdom, but a stage for divinity. Every coin minted bore the twin profiles of the royal siblings side by side, equal in majesty. On one side, Greek inscriptions proclaimed them Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving gods. On the other, Egyptian hieroglyphs showed them offering blessings to the land. Even the architecture of Alexandria began to change. Temples were built not merely to house gods but to celebrate the union of mortal and divine embodied by the royal pair. In frescoes and reliefs, Arsinoe appeared as Isis reborn, her arms outstretched over the fertile flood of the Nile. She did not merely perform rituals, she redesigned them. When festivals were held, she stood beside her brother as co-ruler, receiving offerings from priests and generals alike. The people no longer saw her as a queen consort, but as the other half of Egypt's soul. And yet, even divinity demands strategy. In council, Arsinoe's voice carried the weight of law. Her brother may have been pharaoh in name, but few decisions were made without her counsel. The court soon learned that her smile was as dangerous as her silence. Ambassadors came from distant kingdoms, from Athens, from Seleucia, from Pergamon, and each left humbled by her intellect. She was particularly skilled in reading men, not their words, but the spaces between them. She could turn flattery into allegiance, and insult into leverage. "Never strike where men expect it," she once told an advisor. "Strike where they are proud." Her first great test came with the First Syrian War in 274 BCE. The Seleucid Empire, fractured by rebellion after the death of its founder, was vulnerable. Ptolemy II hesitated the scholar in him, mistrusting the gamble of war. But Arsinoe, seasoned by the memory of her husband's fall, understood that hesitation was death. "Strike now," she urged, "before they remember how to unite." Her words carried the weight of experience the wisdom bought with the lives of her sons. And so Egypt's armies marched. The campaign was brutal but swift, reclaiming lost cities and territories along the Levantine coast. Arsinoe herself accompanied parts of the campaign, her presence a symbol of divine favor. When victory came, it was celebrated not as the triumph of generals, but of gods. In Alexandria, the poets sang, "As Isis guarded Osiris through the night of chaos, so did Arsinoe guide Egypt through the storm." The victory solidified her place as co-ruler, not consort. Ptolemy II was no longer simply pharaoh, he was one half of a sacred pair. And Arsinoe, once a pawn traded among kings, now sat at the center of power, unassailable, divine, and terrifying in her calm. But her reign was not only one of politics, it was cultural resurrection. She revived patronage of the arts and sciences, expanding the Library of Alexandria and ensuring that poets, astronomers, and philosophers from across the world flocked to her court. Among them was Theocritus, who wrote verses likening her to Hera, the Queen of Heaven, and to Aphrodite, the goddess of love reborn in wisdom. Her name became legend, whispered with awe in the marble halls of Athens, and carved in gold upon temple walls in Thebes. Yet, even as the world bowed before her, Arsinoe remained haunted by shadows. In the quiet hours, when the palace corridors were still, she would stand before her mirror of polished bronze and see not a goddess, but a woman, one who had buried 2 sons, betrayed by her own blood, and been forced to sanctify her own suffering. Sometimes, servants passing her chamber claimed to hear her whispering prayers in the old Egyptian tongue, prayers not found in any ritual, words meant only for the dead. But she never allowed grief to soften her resolve. Instead, she forged it into power, transforming her trauma into doctrine. Her past, every humiliation, every loss became a tool. Her marriages to kings and brothers became myth. Her scars became symbols of divine endurance. Arsinoe had done the impossible. She had taken the most taboo act in the Greek world, incest, and made it the cornerstone of divine kingship. What had once been a mark of disgrace was now the source of Egypt's legitimacy. And in that paradox lay her greatest triumph and her greatest tragedy. For though Egypt adored her, the queen was no longer entirely human. To be a goddess meant to be eternal, yes, but also untouchable, unreachable. Late in her reign, when a foreign envoy asked her how she wished to be remembered, Arsinoe smiled faintly and replied, "As the woman who made the impossible sacred." Outside, the Nile shimmered in the moonlight, winding through the desert like a silver serpent. The floodwaters had risen early that year, a good omen, the priest said. But perhaps it was something else. The river itself paying tribute to the queen who had learned to rule like the gods with both mercy and terror. By the time the gods called her home, Arsinoe Philadelphus had become more than a queen. She was an institution, a myth living among mortals, the embodiment of Egypt's divine order. For 16 years she had ruled beside her brother, reshaping not only the kingdom but the very idea of kingship. The rituals she devised, the coins she minted, the temples she founded, all of them proclaimed a single, audacious truth. Mortality could be conquered through divinity. No one remembered the girl who had once trembled beneath a wedding veil in Macedonia. The world now saw only the goddess with 2 crowns, whose image adorned shrines from Cyrene to Nubia. Her name was invoked in prayers for fertility, safe childbirth, and the health of the Nile. She had become, in every sense, Isis reborn, except Isis, legend said, had been rewarded with peace. Arsinoe had never known such luxury. By her late 40s, the brilliance of her reign began to cast long shadows. She had no children of her own. Her brother's heirs came from another woman, the queen he had divorced, to make this divine marriage possible. To secure her legacy, Arsinoe did something no woman before her had dared. She made her divinity official while still alive. Across Egypt, temples were commissioned in her name. Priests were ordained to maintain her cult, to keep the sacred fires burning day and night. Statues depicted her with the horns of Hathor, the throne of Isis, and the serenity of Ma'at, truth itself. She presided over her own festivals, standing upon gilded chariots as the people threw lotus blossoms at her feet. Even death would not erase her. That was the design. The poet Theocritus, in one of his hymns, called her the eternal one who walks among us, and compared her to the morning star, distant, luminous, and unyielding. Scholars in the Library of Alexandria began treating her decrees as scripture, studying her words for hidden wisdom. It was brilliant politics, disguised as piety. By immortalizing herself, Arsinoe ensured that her power would outlive her body, a truth her rivals would not recognize until it was far too late. In 270 BCE, she fell ill. The cause is unknown. Age, poison, perhaps the exhaustion of being divine for too long. Her death was mourned not as a loss, but as a transformation. The priests declared that she had merely shed her mortal form to join the gods above. Her funeral lasted weeks. The procession began in the Palace of Alexandria, winding through streets carpeted with flowers and lined with mourners. The people wept openly, as if the Nile itself had ceased to flow. Behind the bier walked Ptolemy II, bareheaded, carrying a golden effigy of his sister wife. His eyes were red, but his expression was composed, the calm of a man who understood that even grief could be theatre. When the final prayers were spoken, her body was placed in a magnificent tomb, part temple, part sanctuary, where her cult would thrive for centuries. She was now Arsinoe Philadelphus, the brother-loving goddess, protector of sailors, patron of queens, mother of the nation. Her image appeared on coins long after her death, her name invoked in oaths and vows. The transformation was complete. The woman who had been bartered, exiled, and betrayed had become a cornerstone of eternity. And yet, her legacy was not one of peace. The system she created, the sacred marriage of siblings, the fusion of divinity and blood, would become the foundation of the Ptolemaic dynasty, binding Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. But it would also curse it. Future queens followed her example, marrying their brothers in the name of divine balance. Some would rule wisely, others would drown in intrigue and violence. The line she sanctified would end in tragedy, with Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen, a woman who, like Arsinoe, wielded beauty and intellect as weapons, and who would one day face the Romans with the same calm defiance her ancestor had once shown to Macedonian kings. When Julius Caesar first met Cleopatra, he reportedly asked an advisor how she carried herself with such unearthly confidence. "She is her ancestor's heir," the man replied. "She carries Arsinoe's shadow." And indeed, the shadow of Arsinoe stretched across centuries. Her cult endured even under Roman rule. Sailors prayed to her image for calm seas. Scholars inscribed her name alongside that of Isis and Athena. Even the emperors who conquered Egypt adopted fragments of her legacy, for they, too, wished to be gods among men. But perhaps the truest tribute to Arsinoe was not in marble or scripture, but in the paradox she left behind. She had been forced into incest, twice, once as a victim, and once as an architect. She had loved and lost, plotted and survived. She had turned humiliation into holiness, transforming chains into crowns. Her story was not simply one of triumph or tragedy, it was both, intertwined like the serpents that adorned her crown. To survive in her world, she had to become something beyond human, and in doing so, she lost the very thing she once fought to protect, her humanity. At dusk, the priest said, when the sun bled over the Nile and the papyrus fields turned to gold, the wind carried her whisper, still a voice neither mortal nor divine, saying, "Power is never given, it is taken, and once taken, it demands its price." In the quiet that followed her death, Egypt continued as she had shaped it. Kings and queens calling themselves gods, lovers binding blood to blood in the name of destiny. And though centuries would pass, every time a royal couple stood before the altar in imitation of Isis and Osiris, their priests would invoke the first who dared, the woman who made the impossible sacred. Her sons were gone, her lovers turned to dust, but her creation endured. The divine marriage, the symbol of eternal kingship, became her monument, a monument written not in stone, but in the memory of power itself. As night fell over Alexandria, the waves whispered against the shore, carrying her name like a prayer, and in the royal gardens, beneath the flicker of the temple lamps, the ghosts of 2 murdered boys seemed to laugh once more, their voices mingling with the hum of the city, a soft reminder that every dynasty, no matter how divine, is built upon the bones of love and loss. The queen who had been forced into incest by her father's ambition had remade that sin into divinity. The woman who had been a pawn became a goddess. The victim became the architect of eternity. And for that, the world would never forget Arsinoe II of Egypt, the queen who defied the gods and became one.